Huh? Reviewing every Mario game? When are you gonna review every Wario game? That would get you 3 billion views in one day. Wah!
Since I made the previous episode of reviewing every Mario game, Nintendo went ahead and announced 3 more, those being Mario RPG Remake, the untitled Princess Peach game, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Suffice it to say, this series just got another episode, so look forward to that in like 300 years. Now to put this episode into perspective, the biggest difficulty with the previous episodes wasn't editing the video, writing the script, or recording it. That was actually the fun part for me. No, actually, the biggest challenge a lot of the time was playing the games themselves, because as great as Mario is, a lot of those games are kinda lame, and if there's one thing you probably figured out by now, it's that it's not all good times with Mario. Usually I can find at least one nice thing to say about any given video game, even if it's something like Saints Row 5. But when I gotta play stuff like Mario's Learning Rainbow or whatever, let's just say I'm gonna be really reaching. Concerning those games specifically, we're not completely out of the woods yet, but this episode contains a number of super heavy hitters, and you'll know the games I'm talking about when I get to them. We are very quickly approaching the big boy era of Mario, so there are a lot more big boy titles involved. I would also like to note before I begin that there was a version of Donkey Kong for the Nelsonic Game Watch that I think I forgot to mention. It was released in between Mario and Wario and Mario's Time Machine, so if I was on top of that like I should have been, I would have mentioned it in the previous episode. So I do apologize for that. Granted, I don't imagine anybody is too broken up about a Game Watch title. Actually, knowing my luck, this game's biggest fan is probably watching this video right now, but setting that aside, our first game, I can confidently say, has next to no fans whatsoever. The year is 1994. Just the previous year, Sega had released the Sega CD worldwide, a CD-based add-on for the Sega Genesis that allowed enhanced futuristic games and had capabilities that the cartridge-based machines did not. Despite only ever achieving modest success, it was clear that CDs were a growing technology with untapped potential. Whether it was a matter of trying to stay ahead of the times or just an attempt to clap back at Sega's increasingly combative marketing campaign, Nintendo teamed up with a company called Sony to create a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo. Maybe you've heard of this company before. It did not go as planned, and Sony was left emotionally distraught and thirsty for revenge. Meanwhile, Nintendo teams up with another company called Philips to restart the project, but that didn't go as planned either. Nintendo did, however, sign off on a couple of licensed games for their existing CDI console. Of course, you had the trilogy of hilariously bad Zelda titles.
How about a kiss for luck?
But then there was Hotel Mario, which is also hilariously bad.
Spaghetti!
The way I discovered Hotel Mario was the same way I imagine most people my age did, which is through YouTube poops and memes. Through the power of video editing softwares, people would sentence mix the already goofy cutscenes into bizarro 2010s internet bliss.
Luigi, look! Yay, Bowser! Get off of my fingers!
That was the thing that set this game apart. It had these cartoonish cutscenes, obviously taking advantage of the CD format. The sheer volume of voice-acted cutscenes was never going to fit on a Super Nintendo cartridge, and that was one of the exciting things about CDs, their storage space. From what I understand, the biggest Super Nintendo games were roughly 48 megabits in size, which is about 6 megabytes. Compare this to CDs, which could hold up to 700 megabytes of data, and you don't have to be a math genius to know that that's a way bigger number than 6. That being said, this was still very early in the era of CDs as a video game technology, meaning that the application of said technology was often very shallow, and usually amounted to some pre-rendered or pre-recorded video duct taped to a mediocre video game to give the illusion that it was far more groundbreaking than it actually was. And that's basically what Hotel Mario is. Take a look at the visuals, they're just barely on par with the Super Nintendo, and that was a cartridge-based system that came out years before. Now, the cutscenes are funny, but I can find those on YouTube anytime I want, which means that the only reason to play this game today is for the gameplay. So what is the gameplay of Hotel Mario? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's closing doors. Yeah. You gotta close all these doors before the time runs out and without getting killed by Goombas, Koopas, and these stupid wigglers. We've seen this man topple kingdoms, save lives, destroy buildings, be a boxing ref, and now he's closing doors. I've never seen such an overqualified individual be wasted on such a menial task. It's kinda depressing when you think about it. It's like looking into an alternate universe where Robert De Niro has to do commercials for toothpaste just to put food on the table. And this hotel is looking a little rough too. I guess you could call it a has-been hotel. What? The game itself is just ass, and not the good kind either. You go up and down through elevators, which you then have to manually step out of to move. Then close doors, go up to the next floor, and do it all over again, except enemies can actually re-open doors when you leave. And enemies that are on the floor above you can kill you if you touch them while trying to jump over another enemy on the floor that you're currently on. I guess it could be spun as strategic if you were being super generous, but if you're being real, it's just kinda stupid. The gameplay with a couple of tweaks would be alright for an arcade setting or for the NES or something, but there just isn't enough here to justify being a big console game in 1994, the same year the PlayStation came out. The cutscenes are the highlight of the game, but you can't just have Mario say, "Toast is toast toast and it's toasty," and act like you made a AAA Mario game, alright? I mean, Nintendo fans are loyal, but they're not stupid. You know, most of the time. I think my favorite thing about Hotel Mario is the music. I don't know why I'm addicted to this song, but I am, and I am convinced that my life is now ruined because of it. Since I brought up the CDI, I thought I'd give you guys a little bonus section on a game called Super Mario's Wacky Worlds. If you've never heard of this game, that's because it doesn't officially exist. This was intended to be a CDI-based sequel to Super Mario World, and in an alternate universe, it might have been the CDI's killer app. An early prototype was slapped together by two developers who allegedly crunched their asses off for 2 straight weeks to be able to present something to Nintendo. Although Nintendo was impressed by their work, the CDI simply wasn't selling enough units, and obviously investing AAA time and money in a game that didn't have a AAA install base would have been a tactically poor decision, so it was eventually shelved. Fast forward several years, and a prototype of the game was actually leaked onto the internet and can be played on emulators and even CDI consoles if you have the know-how. Mario has been around for over 4 decades now, so there has naturally been a lot of unreleased content during that time, whether those be cancelled games or demonstrations that were never intended to be commercially released games at all. So under normal circumstances, I would not dedicate a whole chapter to something like this. But the reason I'm bringing special attention to this one is purely because it can actually be accessed. It is very rare that we actually get to see stuff like this in the flesh, so when it does happen, I will never pass up an opportunity to talk about it. If this game looks super rough and unfinished, that's because it is. The collision is completely busted and is entirely disconnected from the visuals half the time. The controls are wonky and slippery. Mario cannot be killed, allowing him to push enemies off the cliff, except there's no gravity, so they're just suspended in the air. The music is taken directly from Super Mario World, but it doesn't loop properly, leading me to believe that it's just playing back a pre-recorded audio file, which is probably exactly what's happening. Textures and sprite work are often broken, and some levels look like Pac-Man for the Atari 2600. But sometimes it actually does look surprisingly good, like this underwater level with the wavy effects, or this area where you can actually see your reflection. That's actually really pretty. To be honest, it really does look like a game that could be tweaked and polished into something good. The locale is often quite different from the typical Mario game of the time, which I guess is where the Wacky Worlds come in. In its current state, they do have a semi-functional game engine here, and I imagine if it were allowed to be fully developed, it could have been one of the more memorable titles on the system. It is less functional than Hotel Mario for sure, but the foundation is there for a game that in an alternate universe would have probably made for a way more fun experience. When all is said and done, I'm not too broken up about losing out on this game. It's just another fascinating archaeological find at the end of the day. Donkey Kong for the Game Boy, sometimes referred to colloquially as DK94. Now this is a weird one. At first it looks like just another one of 3 billion Donkey Kong ports, this time for the Game Boy. You play through the 4 classic levels from the original, just scaled down to Game Boy size, and then when you finish those, the game hits you with the biggest plot twist of all time. Turns out, the entirety of Donkey Kong Arcade is merely an introductory chapter to this game, like a tutorial segment. The game is actually a never-ending gauntlet of 101 stages, making it 25 times bigger than the original. And I just gotta say, god donkey damn, this is a Game Boy game from 1994. This is bananas. How is a Game Boy game this big? And it's not just superficially bloated size and scope either. DK94 is a legitimate video game. It's not just an action platformer like the original. It's an intricate puzzle game where you have to unlock doors with keys and traverse treacherous terrain by solving environmental conundrums, creating platforms and ladders in strategic places and using enemies to your advantage. On top of this, Mario is now a goddamn Olympic gymnast and figure skater. He can handstand and launch himself out of a handstand and backflip 100 feet in the air. And climb up trees. I did this by accident the first time and I was completely speechless. There are 3D Mario games that don't have this level of versatility, and it actually works too. It works well. It puts your brain to work too. You have to actually think about what you're doing and have a real sense of positioning and timing. Not to mention the game eggs you on with optional collectibles that adds a great deal of replayability. Visually, the game has very expressive sprite work and great animations. It's very clear that this is a late Game Boy title as well. Going from Super Mario Land 1 to this is like going from Wolfenstein to Half-Life. And at the time, it was considered one of the best Game Boy titles, and it absolutely does show. This game is the real deal. I guess you could say it's on, like the video game Donkey Kong. Unfortunately, Mario is still not all fun and games. At this time, Mario is still doing licensed educational spin-offs. And what we have here is Mario's Early Years, a trilogy of educational games dual released on DOS and Super Nintendo. The first of these games is Fun with Letters, where you play as Mario and learn about letters through these little mini-games. You might think a game like this is completely useless to an adult, but as somebody who recites the alphabet out loud under his breath whenever he can't find a file folder in Windows, I can appreciate the refresher. A, B, C, D, E, F. Oh shit. I expected the Super Nintendo version to be a platformer that tried to emulate the PC game in some respect, kinda like Mario is Missing. Instead, it's pretty much the same exact game because it uses the Super Nintendo mouse. This version of the game is honestly really funny because of the voices. They remind me of those text-to-speech programs we used to use to make Freddy Fazbear say f***, except it's all pre-recorded voice lines where a child was asked to read out every single word individually on its own, and then it was sentence mixed into a regular sentence.
You found apple that starts with A.
The things you gotta do to fit voice acting on a Super Nintendo cartridge. Then we got Fun with Numbers, also a dual release. This one comes with a funny voice that cheers you on.
That worked for me!
By default, I prefer the Super Nintendo version because the DOS version is impossible to get working properly on a modern non-DOS machine, to the point that it gives me a whole new perspective and appreciation for the pain of installing NVIDIA drivers. And finally, there is preschool fun. The fundamentals of this game are mostly the same with the point-and-click format, but instead of learning about numbers and letters, this is the game where you learn that the pigs go oink. You never know when that information might come in handy. After their educational escapade, Nintendo re-released Super Mario All-Stars, this time with Super Mario World included. I guess both games were no longer selling as well after years on the market, so they tried to sweeten the deal with this. If you played Super Mario World and Super Mario All-Stars, you pretty much played this already. And I have, so I have. Yeah, that'll do it. Up next, we got a real game, Tetris and Dr. Mario. Now, I like both of those things, so naturally I was curious to see what this game was. I was expecting some kind of fusion thing, like somehow it would marry the gameplay of either game to each other and make something weird and new. I was a little disappointed to find that it was literally just that. It's Tetris and it's Dr. Mario, 2 games in 1. Nothing groundbreaking, but I have no complaints about either of those games, which is more than can be said for a lot of the stuff we've looked at. There is a 2-player mode where it swaps between games every other round or something, but other than that, it's just your usual Tetris and Dr. Mario. That being said, these are entirely complete versions of the games with far better visuals and sound effects than the earlier versions, so if I went back in time, this would have been a pretty good deal for the money. Even today, developers often neglect to actually add any genuine enhancements to re-release titles, so it's nice to see that they had their head in the right place. Mario's Picross is a game I've heard of in passing over the years, but I had no idea what it was actually about. I've heard people say that it's really good, and I assumed it was some kind of bit, like when I say Earthworm Jim 3D has a better story than The Last of Us, but it turns out that, yeah, this game is honestly really good. I had never heard the word Picross outside of this game, but effectively it's a logic puzzle type deal where you have to break tiles on a grid in a very particular way. Every row and column has a list of numbers next to it, and those numbers correspond to the number of consecutive tiles that are to be broken in that row and column with space in between. So you have to break them such that they fit the pattern, but also that they don't conflict with the pattern on the other axis. Similarly to something like Sudoku, I guess, it tests your powers of deduction and ability to think outside the box. Typically, I would start by seeing which row or column had a big number in it, and then I would imagine putting that number of consecutive tiles at either end of the row or column, and then break the tiles where those two areas intersect, and that kicks you off to a really good start. This is a thinking man's game, you know what I'm saying? This is the game you play to keep your brain from stagnating. It's the type of game you play to raise your IQ. In the case of this game, the grid patterns usually turn out to be pictures of something like a little Game Boy or a round box with holes. Oh wait, that's bread. This is the perfect kind of game for Game Boy, and it's not dissimilar to the types of games you'd play on your phone today. And when you really think about it, phone gaming is just the natural evolution of the Game Boy. Unfortunately, this game did not sell very well outside of Japan, and if I had to guess why, it probably had to do with the fact that most gamers wanted a gamey kind of game, and this looks more like the crossword your dad does on the newspaper on Saturdays. It's a real shame because I had a lot of fun playing it. It has a weird way of devouring my attention and holding it for an extensive duration. Sometimes I get scared that I won't be able to put it down, so if you're wondering why it took so long to get this video out the door, this is why. Because Mario's Picross is pretty good. This next game is a very interesting case. This is BS Mario USA Power Challenge for the SatellaView. Now if you're unfamiliar with the SatellaView, then listen up because this is a big and very interesting history lesson. The SatellaView was an add-on for the Super Famicom that was only released in Japan, and even there, it was not a common piece of equipment. This thing was a collaboration between Nintendo and a struggling satellite radio company, and basically it allowed you to download media from the net, and of course that included video games. This is a functionality that is taken for granted today, but was incredibly forward-looking for 1995, especially for a video game console. Even the PCs of the time were struggling with internet functions. Remember when you'd get booted off your deathmatch server because your mom had to call somebody? Yeah, Truly it was the Dark Age. The SatellaView had some sweet exclusive goodies, but its release was relatively limited due to its high price, the fact that it wasn't widely distributed, and the fact that you needed to already own a Super Famicom to use it. Because of all of these factors, enthusiasts, myself included, have designated it a hotbed for lost media, kinda like the Nintendo 64 DD, but we're gonna talk about that later. A SatellaView game would typically consist of several episodes that were released by the week, and of course one such game was Super Mario Bros. 2. This is an altered version of the existing version of Super Mario Bros. 2 that's on the All-Stars collection. I like to call this Super Mario Bros. 2 Weird Edition, as though the original game wasn't already weird enough. There's a lot of bizarre things that happen in this version. There's a score counter which never existed in the original game. Enemies just turn into hearts seemingly out of nowhere. One time I turned into Peach for no discernible reason. And these boxes with talking characters keep popping up. If I had to guess, the characters are supposed to be audibly saying hints to the player, as the SatellaView had the ability to broadcast narration over the games, at least from what I understand. It's a pretty ambitious and novel concept in theory, but a lot of the functionality has been lost to time as the service has been long discontinued. When all is said and done, SatellaView and everything related to it can be considered an archaeological find, and the games themselves, perhaps even more so. Speaking of archaeological finds, the Virtual Boy. One of Nintendo's most infamous fumbles, not counting whatever mistakes they might have made before becoming the video game company. By the year 1995, Sega had already entered the next generation, not to mention Sony entered the ring with PlayStation, so the Super Nintendo was still coasting along for a couple of years, despite the technology being far outmatched by their competitors and their new hardware. It was pretty obvious that Nintendo needed a new champion, but the Nintendo 64 wouldn't be released for another year yet, so the Virtual Boy, in theory, was supposed to act as a stand-in while they perfected their secret weapon. If you've never heard of this, basically it was a big chonky VR headset thing that you propped up on a table and stuck your face into to see games in 3D. At the time, it was a very forward-looking machine. It was substantially more powerful than the Game Boy. It was 32-bit because apparently that made a difference. And it was one of the most notable early examples of video games embracing stereoscopic 3D. There are only two problems. 1, it's terrible. 2, it sucks. Even today, despite the marketing, VR headsets aren't accessible to casual demographics the same way regular gaming is, so as you can imagine, the 1995 equivalent is gonna be a doozy. Images could only be displayed in red and black due to technical limitations. It didn't have a head strap, so playing it would be obscenely uncomfortable, forcing you to sit in a specific position during gameplay. The battery was attached to the controller, which is just straight up weird. And it caused severe eye strain very quickly, so that wasn't great. This thing couldn't even break 1 million before being discontinued after only about a year, including both the Japanese and North American release. The system's development cycle was troubled since the beginning because Nintendo was more focused on the Nintendo 64, which was being developed at the same time. And Gunpei Yokoi, the Game Boy creator who was spearheading the project, ended up heading a lot of the blame for its failure. Which is a little unfair. I mean, it's not like it was entirely his fault. Of course, no Nintendo console is complete without a flagship Mario title, so what did Nintendo do to legitimize this weird alien technology? Mario's Tennis. Why Mario Tennis? Because shut up. It opens on a ball being hit in your face from across the tennis court just to show you all that 3D goodness. It's like when 3D had a resurgence in movie theaters, so every single movie had to have at least 15 shots where a character is sticking something right in your face. There isn't really a way to convey the 3D effect without actually owning a Virtual Boy yourself, and that's the true weakness of consumer-grade 3D. You cannot market it the same way you can market pretty graphics and amazing dialogue, because there's no way to summarize its effect on a 2D video or image. And 99.9% of people watching these commercials are gonna be watching on a 2D display, so yeah, it's not great. The game itself is serviceable, but I am not great at it. I guess the most unique thing about it is that it uses a third person behind the character's back perspective instead of a top-down view like Mario's previous tennis escapades. Gotta make that 3D worth it somehow. It might have been more immersive in first person, but if I sat here pondering the wasted potential of a Mario-based sports simulator on a console that nobody owned, I would probably turn into an insane person. Otherwise, Mario Tennis has never been a system seller in the best of times, so if you're looking for that Virtual Boy killer app, this probably isn't it. Not that you have a lot of choice. I mean, how many games were there? Like 7? Yoshi's Island is one of those games that until recently I never really got into, not unlike the first Super Mario World. Supposedly, it's one of the best Super Nintendo games ever made. I've heard people say this game was their entire childhood, which is kinda poetic, considering it's a game about making sure a baby doesn't die. Funnily enough, it actually was part of my own childhood, but I had the Game Boy Advance version. I didn't even know it was a Super Nintendo game at the time. And yes, I am gonna talk about that version later, so don't you worry. Although it's called Super Mario World 2, it's actually a prequel like Red Dead Redemption. You play as a Yoshi on your quest to help baby Mario save baby Luigi and reunite them with their parents who are almost never acknowledged or referred to again for the remainder of the entire Mario series. Unless you count the movie, but you know what I meant. I guess during this time they were still trying to figure out who Mario was and where he came from. Today, the idea of Mario as a human is one of those topics that's mostly up in the air because the games don't tend to be very story-driven, so whatever the canon was back when this game was made, you can pretty much count on that not being real anymore. Yoshi's Island is definitely not the first game with Yoshi in the spotlight, and it certainly wasn't the last, but I think if you said Yoshi game, nobody's gonna be thinking about stupid-ass Yoshi on NES or even Yoshi's Cookie, which is slightly better. They probably think of Yoshi's Island, and for good reason, because believe it or not, this is a good video game. Pretty much every Nintendo nerd from that era cherishes this game like their firstborn, their own baby Mario if you will, because it did a lot of things very, very well. The first thing you'll notice about this game is the visuals. This is easily one of the best looking games that has ever graced the Super Nintendo. There is a uniquely illustrated feel to the game's visuals. Playing this game feels like walking through the pages of an illustrated children's storybook with moving pictures. And it remains a very appealing game to look at, even to this day. A lot of this is thanks to the Super FX Chip 2, which is an improved version of the technology that powered the original Star Fox and also allowed one of the worst ports of Doom ever created. There are all kinds of neat lighting effects, tons of atmospheric touches, sprite scaling, expressive animations, and even some 3D effects just to push it over the line. Visually, the game is phenomenal, and it stands among the top tier of Super Nintendo visuals, and it's probably because of games like this that the Super Nintendo was able to survive as long as it did, despite its direct competitors putting out dramatically more impressive hardware by this time. But really, it's the music that you'll remember the most. Yoshi's Island has an amazing soundtrack full of memorable bangers and tons of tunes that are not referenced nearly enough in subsequent games. These songs are going to be playing in your head even after you shut off the game. One of my favorites is the map screen because they add another instrument every time you unlock another world. There is a huge variety of enemies in Yoshi's Island, possibly more so than any of the previous titles. Giant piranha plants just sit there flapping their mouths, stupid little mice, bats, there's an enemy that's just a cannon with feet. Shy Guys, Fly Guys, Die Guys, and then you fight a little blue hedgehog that runs around really fast. Now when this guy showed up in Mario 2, there's no way you could have made the connection to Sonic, but this was 1995, so I'm choosing to believe that this was an intentional reference. I feel like this is perhaps the first mainline 2D Mario to truly reinvent the formula. Don't get me wrong, previous 2D Mario titles were all different in their own ways, but the fundamentals were almost always the same, with the possible exception of Super Mario Bros. 2 USA. Although this game has the word Super Mario World in the title, the game is nothing at all like Super Mario World, and after playing through the game, I now understand why I never got far into it as a kid. Because Yoshi's Island is weird. Really weird. The levels have a greater reliance on environmental puzzles and roundabout non-linear paths rather than just pure platforming and walking to the right. As a kid playing the GBA version, I remember getting stuck very often and just quitting and playing the new version of Mario Bros. They had on the cartridge instead. Even today, these less straightforward levels often end up being the weakest parts of the game for me because they interfere with the pacing. Take this level for instance, you get a key that opens this door to immediately run into another door that requires another key, so you exit, go up here, do this big ass room to get another key, walk all the way back, open the next door, walk to the end of the hallway, you son of a bitch. Leave again, conquer the dungeon of piss and lava, get another key, walk all the way back, and f*** you Nintendo. There was one level where I actually had to look up what I was supposed to do. That is insane. I don't think I've ever had that happen in a 2D Mario game before. Granted, none of these things end up ruining an otherwise really good video game, and you'll find that it's the weird stuff that ends up being the most endearing quality. Yoshi handles nothing like Mario, he's always running at full speed, there's no time limit, no mushrooms, not as items anyway, and the level design is completely different, far more maze-like and with much greater variety in elevation and terrain. The pacing of Yoshi's Island is not remotely the same as the other 2D Marios. The other games had frequent moments where you're just gunning it down a hallway, jumping at the right times like a madman. Yoshi's Island has 2 or 3 levels like that, but for the most part the pacing is far more controlled and reined in by comparison. Levels are far more interactive, and with the addition of a renewable projectile that you can use at any time by eating enemies and turning them into eggs, it makes for a far more aggressive game. Throwing these things around never gets old. You can even pull off trick shots, bouncing them off walls into enemies and items like Revolver Ocelot. Yoshi's ability to devour enemies and turn them into eggs which he can use as disposable projectiles is at odds with a game that is otherwise very childlike, but you have to accept it because it's fun as hell. In all seriousness though, the game can actually be pretty bizarre at times. There's a boss fight with a frog where you get turned really small and then he eats you. So you have to throw eggs at his uvula to make him vomit you back out, and the whole time you're in there dodging digestive juices coming down like rain. This is nasty. How did they put this in the game? I guess the 90s really was the barf age. And look at this, there are these white puffballs floating through the air, and when you eat them, you get high. I'm not
Making this up now. He is tweaking. He is seeing things that are not there, and he needs a f***ing ambulance.
With the exception of certain stage hazards, Yoshi cannot be killed by any normal means. At the same time, he also carries a little baby everywhere, so he's basically Sam Porter Bridges, which makes Yoshi's Island the E-rated version of Death Stranding. When Yoshi gets hurt, Baby Mario is trapped in a bubble to be stolen by the Magic Koopa gang, and this is the lose condition of the game. If you collect these little star bits, you have more time to save him if you get hurt. Between this and almost always having a projectile, not to mention the lack of a time limit, you might think the game would be way too easy, and sometimes it is, but they balance it with sneaky tricks in some areas that are downright frustrating. It really sucks when you're in a tight area with a bunch of enemies and you keep getting knocked around while trying to get this stupid baby to come back. This is how I imagine raising an actual child is like. But every single time I come back to it, I learn something new that makes the game a little bit better, like how when Mario gets caught in the bubble, you can throw eggs at him to knock it to the ground, which means you don't have to chase after it as much. And also that you can ground pound the egg dispenser to make it shoot out 6 at a time. Both of those things would have been great to know 18 years ago. Probably one of the coolest things about the game is the replayability. Every single level has a bunch of secret collectibles to find, like the 20 red coins and the 5 smiley sunflower guys. All of this is building to a score at the end of the level, and what you really want is that 100 score for every level. Getting this score is an absolute test of patience though. On top of finding every secret collectible, you also have to collect enough stars to have 30 seconds of baby Mario time by the end, which means you have to avoid getting hit so you don't lose it. So, hunt down every single collectible and do it while not getting hurt, and do that for every level. Yoshi's Island is an unbelievably evil video game. To get that 100% score, you have to be ready to sacrifice your soul and your life to Yoshi's Island. I may not have the nostalgic attachment to this game that a lot of people do, but I do believe that this is a great video game and one that you should not neglect just because it's old. By today's standards, there are definitely some things you might wish were changed or improved, but if we're talking big picture here, this is a great video game. And it's got Yoshi. Come on. Everybody loves Yoshi. Wait a minute, y'all want to hear my Yoshi impression? Alright, here it goes. Lasso! How was that? Up next, we got Mario's Game Gallery for the PC. Previous PC-oriented Mario titles were edutainment software that tried to teach you things while also being fun. Sadly, they didn't really do either of those things particularly well, especially the historical ones that were full of straight-up wrong information. This one, by comparison, is more like an actual game. This is a collection of real-life games including checkers, Go Fish, dominoes, backgammon, and yacht, also known as Yahtzee, but all redone with Mario characters. If you've ever played these games in real life, you already know the drill, but the difference is you're playing against Mario. It's not bad or anything, it's a game that exists and it functions exactly as intended. On its surface, it's nothing special at all, until you hear the voice.
It's your turn.
You hear that? That's Charles Martinet, baby. Contrary to what you may have heard, this is actually the first game to be released in which Martinet is the voice of Mario. He has all kinds of voice clips and they're all really fun to listen to. Nintendo liked his performance so much that they decided he was going to be Mario forever. Or not. Up next, it's Mario Super Picross for the Super Famicom. Since the Game Boy one did not sell very well outside of Japan, Nintendo made the decision to make this game a Japanese exclusive, which is a little sad, but thankfully, they actually made it available on the Switch Online service worldwide, so if you have that, you can play this one right now, and to be honest, I do recommend it. The gameplay is fundamentally the same as the Game Boy one, but the presentation is far better because it's on Super Nintendo. It starts out small, uncovering Japanese characters, but it eventually gets far more complex. It is a thinking man's game that puts your brain to work, just like the original. I wonder if they ever tried making a 3D Picross with a third axis. That would be insane. Then we got Mario Clash for the Virtual Boy. I've heard this game get compared to Mario Bros for the arcade, and I can definitely see why, but at the same time, it's actually a very different game. Instead of knocking enemies over by causing earthquakes under their feet, you instead have to throw Koopa shells at them. The Virtual Boy gimmick here is that there's a background and a foreground, and you have to move back and forth between the two. Some enemies require you to throw a Koopa shell at them from the other side of the stage. It's an interesting dynamic and one that could make for a halfway decent video game. Unfortunately, it is not as immediate or intuitive as Mario Bros, and I have to imagine you lose something by not playing on actual hardware, but it is a serviceable title that's fun for a couple of minutes, making it far closer to being a Virtual Boy killer app than tennis. And I guess Waterworld. Undake 30's Samegame is another SatellaView game and is actually pronounced Samegame. Could have fooled me. Now, Samegame is an older title, originally known as Chain Shot, released for our favorite console, the FM7. And I want to say right now that this is actually one of my favorite types of games, at least in the context of this series. Because it just goes to show how ubiquitous Mario is, that he somehow got his name on this age-old puzzle game. Much like something like Tetris, the game has gotten 3 billion different versions over the years, and this one is Mario themed. Now, this is a puzzle game where you get a giant matrix of Mario stuff and you have to clear the entire screen by destroying all the blocks, which you have to do by eliminating groups of 2 or more connecting pieces of the same type. The gimmick is that the tiles are brought down by gravity and columns will shift to the left when one is eliminated. The game does not provide more tiles or anything like that at any point, which means that it's very easy to break them in a bad sequence and make the puzzle unsolvable, and you will. Everyone who plays this game for the first time is gonna lose, and even the 10th time, I just feel like a baboon playing this. I mean, just look at this. How do you win? The real Samegame versions I've seen seem to be very incremental, starting very small before exploding to being some massive thing, gradually pushing the player to their limit. This version just starts out with a big ass 2,000 tile puzzle and you can't even see it all at once because the Super Nintendo would explode. If there is an option for lower difficulties, I cannot tell because the game is entirely in Japanese, but it's another interesting archaeological find from the ancient SatellaView dynasty. Virtual Boy Wario Land is Wario Land for the Virtual Boy. Technically, this is not a Mario game because Mario is not in the title or the game whatsoever, and as such, it does not show up in the giant Wikipedia list I'm referencing, but Wario is part of the Mario family, and I don't know if I'll ever have another chance to talk about it. This is considered to be one of the greatest titles for the Virtual Boy, and for good reason. Despite the misfortune of being a Virtual Boy title, the game happens to be very good on its own terms. The fundamentals of Virtual Boy Wario Land are mostly the same as the Game Boy game. Same as the Game Boy Game, if you will. So if you played that, this will make you feel right at home. This was already a surprisingly deep and polished game from a mechanical standpoint, especially for a portable game in the 90s, so it made sense to put it on Virtual Boy, just to make sure it had at least one guaranteed hit. The 3D gimmick once again utilizes backgrounds and foregrounds, having Wario jump back and forth between them, which is a really cool effect that would probably look even cooler on actual hardware. Visually, the game looks a little more advanced than the Game Boy version, with ripple effects underwater, more detailed sprite work, and more animated background details. Yes, it is in red and black because it's on Virtual Boy, but the Game Boy version was black and greenish gray, so it's not that much worse. Overall, maybe not Wario's greatest achievement, so to speak, but probably the Virtual Boy's most memorable title. Up next, we got another SatellaView game, Excitebike Bun Bun Mario Battle Stadium. Now with a name like that, you can't go wrong. This is a 16-bit remake of the NES game Excitebike, except this time, Mario. The thing that really blew my mind about this game is the voice acting. That is the one thing I was not expecting. Mario has voice clips that would later be reused in Mario Kart 64, and both Luigi and Wario also have voices. Today, Charles Martinet is known for voicing all 3 of these characters, but did you know that in Japan they originally got different guys to be Wario and Luigi? They sound weird, but memorable in their own right. The game itself is fine. I mean, if you played Excitebike, then you already know what's good, except that there's a super mode that lets you boost infinitely without overheating and exploding. Now that's a lot of fun. I guess they wanted a little bit of that Mario Kart flair. And speaking of boosting infinitely, it's time to hold on to your seats because we are about to re-enter big boy territory. Everybody in the entire world loves RPGs, except for a lot of people, as it turns out. I never really thought about it in years gone by, but there's an interesting trend of YouTubers who talk about Nintendo not liking RPGs, by which I mean I can think of 2 people who meet that criteria, but other people could probably name more. If there does exist a pattern of Nintendo fans disliking RPGs, I'm curious as to where it started. Perhaps it was a reaction to Square dumping Nintendo for PlayStation in the 90s, effectively taking away a huge portion of their RPGs. Kinda like the small handful of PlayStation fans today who hate Starfield because it's no longer coming to PlayStation 5. During the Super Nintendo era, Square and Nintendo were tight, which is why Nintendo entrusted them with the Mario license to make a Super Mario RPG, and they called it Super Mario RPG. This game would end up being the swan song not only of Mario titles on the Super Nintendo, not only of big RPGs on the Super Nintendo, but of the partnership between Nintendo and Square. They did release 2 lesser-known RPGs on the Super Nintendo after Mario RPG, but this is the big one that I think everybody remembers. After a generation of releasing big dog RPGs on the Super Nintendo and effectively legitimizing it as the place for that genre, this was the end of an era. The game itself is a very interesting case. RPGs are about the furthest thing from Mario you can think of besides an FPS, and there are a number of vocal people who don't seem to care for them. I think Scott the Woz put it best though, when he said in one of his videos something to the effect of, if you take a genre you don't like, but make it a Mario game, it suddenly becomes far more comforting. And I think that's what this game represents for a lot of people. Even if you're not an RPG guy, but you like Mario, this game will make you feel right at home. My first playthrough of this game was a lot of fun, that is until the save got corrupted and I had to start from square zero. I was like 85% through the game at that point, so that completely knocked the wind out of my desire to play it any further. But now I finally buckled down and made it through the whole thing, and yeah, it's a pretty good game, I guess. This is considered to be a landmark title in the world of Mario spin-offs. It was the first RPG in the franchise and would inform a lot of the design choices and writing of the Paper Mario and the Mario and Luigi series. You have the action command systems, level up system with the bonus options, lovable characters that somehow fit in the game despite not being mainline Mario characters. People love these guys so much that they actually wanted Geno to be a Smash character. I would have preferred Boshi, but hey, that's just me. On top of this, the game is even getting a remake for the Switch, which is coming out this year. That is insane. I never expected that to happen in a million years, so I guess you could say this is kind of a big deal. I cannot wait to play that version. From what I can tell, the remake is primarily audio-visual, keeping most of the fundamentals intact, which is nice. Granted, the original game still looks great in its own right. Square took the Donkey Kong Country approach of pre-rendering a bunch of 3D character models and screenshotting different frames of animation to turn them into sprites. And speaking of Donkey Kong Country, you got this minecart minigame where you have to jump over enemies and collect mushrooms, and take a look at this guy. There's no way that wasn't intentional. A lot of RPGs will have these giant sprawling stories that feel bigger than life, with all-devouring god entities enabled by evil church guys who are secretly clones of some biblical monster who is depicted as a femboy with a big sword, and then it turns out you are the chosen one because of time travel, so you gotta go collect 7 dragon coins to open a portal to the Jesus realm to claim the mighty blast sword of Lazarus, and the whole thing might also be a commentary on how Mario RPG is far more straightforward and takes itself less seriously by comparison. The plot is pretty simple. Rescue Toadstool from Bowser, but then a giant sword dude with eyeballs drops from the sky and goes, "Wee, this is my place now." So you have to actually team up with Bowser, Peach, and Mallow and Geno to collect 7 star pieces to be able to reach him and kick his ass. It won't trigger a life-changing epiphany, it won't make you change your political values or throw a fish at George W. Bush, but it is a fun story with a plot that gives you just enough to latch onto. And with a game like this, that's all you need. I guess if you really wanted to reach for it, you could draw parallels to real-life arms manufacturers, since the main enemy of the game is a weaponsmith who wants to replace everything with weapons, but again, you'd really be reaching. Mario RPG is more interested in its characters and dialogue than its plot, which allows the game to be consistently entertaining without getting bogged down by overly complicated details. There is a real free-spirited weirdness to this game that meshes well with the Mario universe. There is a very clear element of creative liberty that bleeds through every element of the game. You have an original plot with new, unique characters, while existing characters are brought to life with rich and vibrant personalities, which at this time is not something I associate with Mario characters. Bowser meets his own minions who have now started their own lives after getting thrown out of the castle by Smithy, and instead of getting mad, Bowser basically tells them,
"You know what? I'm proud of you. Take care of your family, big guy."
I'm starting to think maybe Bowser isn't so bad. You got Mallow, the cloud dude who wants to prove himself, and Geno, the puppet man who's appointed by God to protect the Star Road. Frog Fuchsius, Booster, Johnny Jones, Power Rangers, and the list goes on. On top of all of this, Mario is now a professional mime. Whenever a character asks him a question about the plot, he starts reenacting the entire cutscene with an absurd dedication to detail. He's a man of many, many talents. And then you fight a purple booby lady named Valentina who absorbs damage with her boobs. How did this character get put into a Mario game? And of course, you cannot forget about the very infamous joke in Princess Toadstool's room where if you examine a certain spot, it says, "You found Toadstool's... huh?" Then her grandmother comes in to reprimand you for rummaging through her stuff like a pervert before giving you a free mushroom to keep quiet about whatever it is you saw. I'm not making this up, this is entirely real. It's never outright said what this is supposed to be, but you already know it's a PlayStation. I always knew she was freaky. There is so much humor and love poured into the dialogue in this game, and this is what makes it worth playing today, the writing. If you played an RPG before, you should be pretty up to speed with the gameplay loop. Turn-based combat, stats, equipment, party members, recovery items, experience-based leveling system.
Turn-based battles in too much text.
But there are some unique Mario quirks to make it stand out. The overworld part of the game functions kinda like an isometric platformer where you are jumping across gaps in platforming. Now, the platforming doesn't always work, you know, the depth perception isn't fantastic, and it's definitely not the highlight of the game by a long shot, but it's a nice addition, and also a nice reminder that this is, in fact, a Mario game. The big thing with the combat is the action commands. If you hit a button at the right time, you can do more damage or even mitigate damage done to you. Just a little change like that makes it more engaging than just selecting an attack and watching it go and praying to the RNG temple monks that it does you good. Unlike Paper Mario though, where it tells you when to press the button, you kinda gotta feel it out for yourself, which isn't so bad until you start getting new weapons that have completely different attack animations and you gotta learn it all over again. It also gets a little muddy when you do an attack and you hear the noise indicating the action command, but it doesn't do as much damage as you were expecting. Is it just regular RNG variance, or is it my fault? The timing isn't way too rigid, so it's usually pretty easy to get the hang of it after a couple of battles, but was definitely done better in later titles. This is not a grindy RPG that will expect you to spend hours of your life farming scrappy little punks just to be able to survive, but I do it anyway, because for one reason or another, I never get tired of becoming an untouchable god in these games and just eating every enemy in 2 hits. This was a great strategy until I got to the final chapter of the game and made the horrifying realization that the level cap is 30. Son of a bitch. When you level up, you can choose between 3 bonus stats, those being attack power, hit points, and flower points, but I always do attack power. My philosophy has always been that you won't need any of that other stuff as long as you can kill enemies faster. If you're as little as 2 or 3 levels higher than the area is expecting, enemies, including bosses, will do 1 damage to you, and keep in mind your HP will be in the triple digits by the end, so it is possible to steamroll most of the game. The game also doesn't have random encounters. All enemies show up on the overworld, meaning that you can usually fight as many or as few as you want. So if you think you're good to go and really don't need any more levels, you can usually just walk around the enemies. Minute-long turn-based fights are the thing that bogs these games down for a lot of people, so this is a pretty great feature, and one that does wonders for the pacing. And that's another thing that Mario RPG is great about. Some RPGs will expect you to dedicate your life to them and will take as long as 80 to 100 hours to beat.
60 hours just to rinse and repeat.
I can understand the appeal of a game that's extremely long. If you judge games purely on a gameplay hours per dollar scale, I can definitely see that as a plus. Me, on the other hand, I found that games that are this long tend to run out of steam and eventually wear out my interest. Mario RPG is like 20 to 25 hours. It ends before the format runs out of steam and causes you to resent it. A lot of this is thanks to the super convenient map screen. Instead of trekking through a big ass world for 3 hours to get to where you need to go, you get a fast travel map screen whenever you leave the area, which makes any backtracking that does need to be done a lot more convenient, and it's something that even the later titles could have used. Thousand Year Door is one of my favorite RPGs of all time, and even that game was struggling with the pacing, expecting the player to backtrack and then forward track, left track, right track, north-south track on a very regular basis. If they ever do remaster or remake Thousand Year Door, it could learn something from its own predecessor, Mario RPG. This is also not the type of game where you're gonna get lost a bunch either. Because the dialogue is usually pretty entertaining, you're less likely to start zoning out and skipping it, so it kinda tricks you into paying attention to the important stuff by proxy. Super Mario RPG packs an incredible soundtrack with some super addicting tunes. The battle song gets old pretty quickly since you're gonna be doing 1,000 battles by the end of the game, but the water raft song, now that's where video games come to life. Super Mario RPG is not only an important game for laying the groundwork for future RPGs in the franchise, but also for being a damn good video game in its own right. It didn't do every single thing correctly, but it's surprising just how many correct things it did, especially considering it was basically the first try. If we can expect that remake to fix what few problems the game does have, then it's a done deal. And to bring this to a close, we got a couple of reruns, one of those being Mario's Time Machine Deluxe. As you might expect, this is a re-release of Mario's Time Machine that, according to Wikipedia, was released in 1996. If it sounds like I'm casting doubt or skepticism on this assertion, that's because the source Wikipedia cites is a weird nothing page from GameSpot that does not seem to indicate a 1996 release date anywhere. I've tried to dig up some information about this one, and I've heard that it's basically the same game, but enhanced with CD-ROM technology, adding stuff like voice acting and maybe better animations. And then there's Mario's Fundamentals. This is basically a re-release of Mario's game gallery for the PC, except this time for Macintosh computers, so no matter what, you already know it's worse. From what I understand, it's mostly the same, so if you played Mario's game gallery, you played Fundamentals without even knowing it. Today, we saw Mario carry the Super Nintendo through an entirely new generation of video games, and for those of you who have been keeping track of every single game in the list as we go, you probably know what game comes next, and it's a very, very big one. To call it a big boy title would be a massive understatement. It will have to wait for next episode, but before I close this video out, I cannot ignore the old but nonetheless very sad news. As I briefly alluded to earlier, Charles Martinet, who has been Mario's voice actor for 3 decades, has stepped down from the role into a new position as Mario Ambassador. Since I spoke about his performance in Mario's game gallery, it seems like an appropriate time for me to properly bring it up in a video. There really isn't a lot that I can say that has not been said already, but if for no other reason than to express my own feelings, I feel like it's appropriate. I may have known that this was eventually going to happen one way or another, and I may be able to understand the many potential reasons why, but it doesn't really make me any less sad. So, with all of that said, here's to Charles, and if he's watching this, thank you so much for voicing your games.
I am a professional actor.
I couldn't possibly audition without being invited. It's humiliating. Where should I go?
Come on, let's go. Let's have more fun. These are my boys. Wahoo! Thank you so much for playing my game.